do acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet today and pay my respects to their ancestors and their descendants. I'd like to kind of thank the organisers for the opportunity to talk about this work and also acknowledge the team that have been involved with doing it. It's a small project, but I think it's quite interesting. Angela's already covered some of the background that I plan to cover, so I'll try and dovetail with what she's already told us. And while this talk sort of was focused on specifically IPD meta-analyses, I think some of the things are common to IPD data sharing in general. So I'll give a bit of a background, but like I say, I'll probably scoot over it a little bit. Talk about why we did this work, how we did it, and what we found, and a few discussion points. So I think everyone will be clear what the difference is between a traditional systematic review and meta-analysis and an IPD meta-analysis. So we're using the original row-by-row data. So with a conventional meta-analysis, there's no risk to the participants. Possibly there's no risk to the participants in IPD, but the considerations are different because you're using the original participant data. And as Angela said, data sharing is either is recognised as very valuable for the reasons that Angela outlined. Funding agencies are often mandating sharing or encouraging sharing. Editors of journals are also, or journals are mandating data sharing or data sharing statements. So of course, we're in a world of data sharing, which is very important, very valuable, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, data sharing has to occur within, sort of the ethical and legal frameworks that exist. So in terms of what guidance available for these things, so obviously in Australia, we have our national statement, and the statement covers this kind of thing in several places. And the 2023 edition, if you like, of the statement goes further than the previous one in terms of its coverage of data sharing, which is fantastic. Internationally, if we look in the literature, though, this kind of thing's received not very much attention at all. So in terms of what kind of guidance do IPD recipients need, so I'm thinking more from the perspective here of recipients of data, there really hasn't been an awful lot done. And I think this paper here is from Angela's group, a recent paper, which was, I saw at the AMOS conference recently, where they held a focus group on this, responsibilities for receiving IPD. And one of the themes here from this focus group was on privacy and ethics. These things, I think, align well with the national statement in Australia. So it's going to make sense and all of those kind of things. So that's a great paper and really nice, but interesting that it's taken so long for such a paper to come out in the literature, given that IPD has been shared for very, very many years. So another source of guidance, which people may be familiar with, is this book, which is a really good, I guess, how-to book on how to conduct IPD meta-analyses. And it's a very substantial book and, is really, I wouldn't call it the Bible, but, it's a sort of go-to reference for these kind of analyses. And as I said, it's a big book, 550 pages, but interestingly, it has less than 2 pages relating to ethics. And that's kind of a bit concerning because, we're talking about data about people. It's not aggregate data. One would expect there'd be at least, some coverage for people to understand ethical considerations, and it might span more than 2 pages. So it provides some broad statements about requirements. And of course, to be fair, requirements vary by jurisdiction wildly. So you can't pin it down to a specific set of rules that's going to apply everywhere. And also provides some sort of key points that you can use to argue when you're seeking approval. And provides one example from a historical IPD-MA study. But the main point is here is sort of like in the previous slide where I was sort of suggesting that guidance has been a little bit slim from the researcher perspective, the recipient perspective. If you go to a good guide like this, the guidance is still rather slim. And so here's some examples of, and these are kind of vague statements. And of course they're vague because, depending on where you are, the country you're in, the system you're in, everything else, it's going to vary. So as it says there, institutions may take different approaches. You may get a waiver from review. You may require reviews. So it's a bit kind of, well, it's as you'd expect, but a little bit unhelpful. And the example guidance here is, these are the kind of things, I guess, that you can put on an ethics approval to try and convince, or to try and explain the reason, why you think you should have your work approved if you're in a system where you do need to apply for approval. So examples to say things like, it won't have identifiers. The questions are very similar to those which the original included studies were asking. And the final one there, that, the evidence that people generally are supportive of data being shared, provided that there are safeguards around confidentiality. I'm not very keen on that argument, but it's in there. And so finally, they give an example from a 2013 paper showing a sort of table of an IPD-MA and sort of the requests that were required. Interesting, that paper from 2013 only has 5 citations in 10 years, which again, does surprise me a little bit, given that it's in the Riley book. So maybe people don't think this is a particularly important problem, I don't know. But I just extracted the table from the original one, so you can see there quite a number of these studies did incorporate consent for the sharing. And so the motivation for doing this work that we decided to do was, well, when we looked at these examples of guidance, and of course they're not comprehensive, it's not a comprehensive review of guidance that's available internationally on how to receive IPD or how to apply for ethics for IPD-MAs. But from these examples, I think the summary is, well, it depends, but here's some things you can say that hopefully you can use to get approval. And it's understandable, but it's a bit unsatisfying. And it left us with the wondering, the curiosity about what people actually do. If this is the guidance that they have, what's the practice? Do people apply for ethics approval? Do they apply for exemptions? Do they do what they like? We don't know. And we thought we might like to have a look at that and learn what the practices are. And then having looked at that, to see whether further guidance is required. So we decided to do a pragmatic review to explore how people describe their ethical considerations and their approvals, etc., in a sample of international IPD-MA studies. And what we decided to do was to build on some work that had already been done. So in 2021, there was a systematic review of the methodological quality of 323 IPD-MAs. That's the Wang study there on the right. And that study in turn used a search strategy from the Nevitt study, published at the same time, I think, which was focused on data retrieval in IPD-MAs. Neither of these two studies considered ethical aspects of IPD-MAs, but we thought, well, they've looked at these two aspects. This is a foundation for us to build on and see what people do with ethics. So what we did was we reused the studies that were identified by the Wang study, the 323, in the supplementary data that was published in the BMJ. The supplementary data had a spreadsheet, which was very handy for us. So we added some columns to the spreadsheet, and then got those papers and extracted any references to ethics that were in the original papers, and then went and looked at protocols as well to see what we could find for each of them, and then summarized the results descriptively. So we could find 315, or rather we reviewed 315, so most of the studies that Wang had identified, One didn't look like it was actually IPD, which is a mystery. 6, we couldn't get the full text, and one looked like a duplicate. Most of them, or half of them, have been published within the last 10 years. And based on the first author, 23 countries were represented in those articles. Some of the articles were multi-country articles, but to kind of classify them, we used the country of the first author. And here's how they look geographically. So about a third of the studies that we included were from the UK. 80% were from 7 countries. And there's really a lot of them in Europe there. And the point here is just to illustrate that they come from a wide range of jurisdictions. So we would naturally expect to see a wide range of variety in ethics statements and expectations and what people do. One thing I should say here is we didn't summarize by journal, like, BMJ, Lancet or whatever, but most of them seem to be in, top tier journals. So 8 of the 315, 2.5%, described having exemptions or waivers, which we thought was quite low. 4% had ethics committee approval. So 22, so only 7% clearly had review committee involvement. So the remainder must have said, well, either we don't need to apply or whatever, or we didn't do anything. A few were unclear. Only one indicated that the de-identified IPD was going to be used according to the purpose that it was originally collected in the included studies, which I thought was really quite interesting. And then 32 declared that ethics approval wasn't needed. Of those, 19 gave reasons. The most common reasons were that you don't need approval for a meta-analysis in our jurisdiction. And this was people in the UK, Belgium, Netherlands, which is interesting because I think if it was a conventional MA, not an IPD-MA, then of course you would say that because it's using aggregate data. The next one was that the study reanalyzed data from studies that had informed consent. So the included studies were consented and their data had been reanalyzed, but it didn't say anything about whether the people that consented had consented to the extended use, the future use. Some said that they used previously published IPD and that there's no consent needed for a systematic review. Again, it's questionable. The IPD won't have been published. Maybe studies using the IPD have been published, but that doesn't kind of excuse you, I don't think, from considering ethics in your study. And a couple of interesting reasons. No, it was de-identified. No ethics needed, could be true in their jurisdiction, and that no new data were collected. These don't seem to me like reasons in themselves without further explanation to say that you don't need to consider ethics. Some ethics statements were very, very well described. So these are 2 examples here. I won't read them out, I don't expect you to read them, but you can see they're extensive. And I like the top left one because they said the ethics of obtaining data were carefully considered and advice was sought. It's uncommon to read an ethics statement where they were that sort of considerate. But there were contradictions as well. So one interesting thing was the ones that said approval's not needed in the jurisdiction. So the ones on the sort of top left of the screen here, you can see we didn't need it in the UK. But then when you look at the right-hand side, you can see that people sought approval from ethics committees, and those ethics committees are in the UK. So unless rules changed over time, I think it's interesting that you can get people in the same jurisdiction that say ethics is not required, and then people that said they went, sought ethics, and the ethics was approved. Not an exemption, but an approval. What's really very interesting also is that the vast majority of these studies did not include any kind of ethics statement. So that's not to say these people are all, being naughty, but what we don't know is whether they considered even what the ethical implications were of their work. It also means that the journals they submitted to didn't require them to provide an ethics statement. So based on the last slide, 80% not reporting anything at all, we sort of came to the conclusion that overall ethical consideration, reporting of ethical considerations is not so great. Most didn't provide any description at all. In some cases, the arguments were questionable without any further information. The reasons they were giving were really concerning. And while IPD-MA itself may or may not introduce additional ethical problems, our feeling was that really the ethical considerations should be described. And it might be the case that further guidance for researchers may be beneficial in terms of education and training to understand the ethical considerations of their studies. So that was my talk. Thank you very much. And thank you for listening, and I hope it was interesting, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Nigel. That was a very interesting talk. I was wondering, in this case, perhaps linking back to Angela's talk, whether having a data sharing, a system might actually help it, and even one that is, this is ideal world where every country or every area has their own, so then it's all interlinked, and we know that if we get it from them, it's properly approved, and if it's gone down the right channels, as opposed to what we see overseas where sometimes it says no ethics needed, but did anyone check if really no ethics approval is needed? It's a bit questionable, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And I think it's true. I think the more there are systems put in place, it's more opportunity to embed information, education and training. So as people are going through the steps on the systems, that even if they were otherwise ignorant about some things, they will learn it through, through, if they're discovering metadata, then they'll be educated on what the requirements might be. And of course, it's always going to vary internationally. And that was, I guess, part of our interest was to see whether and how it varies across countries and how inconsistent it is even within countries. And it was actually surprising to us that, and surprising that journals would accept these IPD without any kind of ethics statement at all.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, Carla has commented or has a question. How much do you think lack of investigation in this area is due to the topic falling between paradigms? For example, too practice focused for many of the ethics journals, not on the topic of health and medical research, to be deemed in scope for medical journals.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a really important point. Yeah. And it's really just really very, very interesting that there's been so little written about it internationally.
Okay. And another question is a question from Susan. Did you consider how the original participants might have responded to those findings? This seems potentially very harmful to patient trust. That's true. Ethics consultation should always be sought.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
I think there's another one that should pop up. If a researcher is using data from another project that didn't obtain proper ethics approval, what is the responsibility? Oh,
I think you can't use data that somebody else didn't get consent for. I don't know. I mean, it seems to me it's not something good question. I don't know. I think if they fail to get proper consent versus, depends what you mean by fail to get proper consent. I suppose if they didn't do the right thing, then you can't unuse their data, can you? If there was something, an integrity issue with the original trial, you wouldn't be wanting to reuse it. If it's a trial where, I know you would assume you would try and include only studies where proper consent was gained, and ideally where consent was gained for extended use.
I mean, Patrick made a comment about plagiarism potentially.
I think you're right, Nigel. So Gordon here. I mean, you're absolutely right. You can really only use data within the scope of the consent you obtain.
Yeah.
And for someone that hasn't obtained consent in the first place, it would be certainly not appropriate to use that data for anything else. So Jackie, Yeah, and obviously important to ensure consent was obtained. But all journals realistically should be asking this question. In fact, they do start to do this now, and I know we've had experience of that, Nigel, where journals are pushing back and actually asking for an ethics statement.
Yeah, great. I think that's a really good thing. Yeah.
Okay, well,